She came on a Tuesday, which was strange because nothing ever happened on a Tuesday in Dunmore. Everett Solano was out on the front steps with his daughter when the black car pulled onto Ridgecroft Lane. Not a taxi, not a rental with a sticker half peeling off the bumper. A car that had been washed that morning and would be washed again before evening, the kind of car that belonged to people who didn't need to think about what things cost. It slowed in front of his house and stopped, and the neighborhood, which had been doing what it always did, existing quietly in the particular way that northern Ontario mill towns exist in late September, with the maples already half gone and the air carrying that smell of cold coming, seemed to hold its breath. His daughter Nina was 7 and had been asking him for 20 minutes whether spiders could dream. He didn't know the answer. He told her he didn't know the answer. She seemed to find this unsatisfying, the way children do when adults fail to be useful. The car door opened. The woman who stepped out was somewhere in her mid-40s, dressed in a wool coat the color of slate, her dark hair pulled back in a way that was either very simple or very expensive. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm, and she looked at the house number, then at the door, then at Everett, and she didn't smile. Most people, showing up somewhere they weren't expected, smile first. It's a reflex, a request for permission to exist in your space. She didn't ask permission. She walked across the cracked concrete of his front path and stopped at the foot of the steps, and she looked up at him the way you look at something you've owed for a long time. "Mr. Solano," she said, "my name is Catherine Bryce Hallett. My father was Gordon Bryce." She said it the way you say a fact you've rehearsed, because if you don't rehearse it, you'll say it the way it actually lives inside you, which is differently. Everett didn't say anything. Nina had gone still beside him, sensing the temperature change the way children always do. "I know you don't have any reason to speak to me," Catherine said, "but I'd like to ask for a few minutes of your time. I drove up from Toronto this morning. 6 hours. She'd driven 6 hours. He looked at her standing there on the path with her expensive coat and her rehearsed sentence and her leather portfolio. And he thought about all the things that Gordon Bryce had taken from him. And he thought about saying nothing, closing the door, going back inside to finish a conversation about whether spiders could dream. What kind of debt makes a woman like that stand at the foot of your steps with her head not quite bowed but close? He'd find out. That was the thing about Everett Solano. He'd always needed to understand the thing completely before he could let it go. "Nina," he said, "go inside and get yourself a snack." Everett had grown up in Dunmore the way most people in Dunmore had grown up in Dunmore, which is to say, not expecting to leave and then leaving anyway, and then coming back when life arranged itself in a way that made coming back feel less like failure and more like sense. He'd done his engineering degree in Waterloo. He'd spent 12 years in northern resource development, the kind of work that takes you to places that don't appear on the maps people carry in their heads. Fly-in camps and temporary roads and winter sites where the sky at 7 in the morning is still the color of a bruise. He'd been good at it. Not famous for it good, but consistently, quietly good. The kind of engineer who gets mentioned in project postmortems because he caught the thing no one else caught. His wife, Diane, had grown up in Timmins. They'd met at a site coordination meeting when she was doing environmental compliance work, and he was running structural assessment for a new access corridor. They'd argued for 45 minutes about soil classification before they'd shaken hands. 4 years later, they'd had Nina. 6 months after that, Diane had died. Not suddenly, which people always assume. Slowly, over 11 months from a diagnosis that came too late and moved too fast. And Everett had learned in that period what he hadn't known before, that grief doesn't arrive like a storm and then pass. It arrives like weather in northern Ontario. It becomes the climate. You don't wait it out, you build your life around it. He came home to Dunmore with an infant and his mother-in-law, Lorena, who was 71 and made the best pea soup he'd ever eaten, and asked him every morning how he'd slept. Not because she expected an honest answer, but because she thought the question itself was a form of care. She was right. It was. He found work with a regional environmental consulting firm. Smaller than what he'd done before, less money, less travel. He could pick Nina up from school. He could be there for the spider questions. He was not by any standard measure a man with enemies. But 3 years ago, Gordon Bryce had made him into a problem to be managed. The Clearwater Renewal Project had come to Dunmore the way development always comes to small northern towns, with a press release and a handshake and a lot of language about partnership and shared prosperity. Gordon Bryce, whose company Hallett Bryce Resource Holdings had been doing business in the region for decades, had brought a proposal to remediate a contaminated stretch of the Clearwater tributary that ran along the eastern edge of town. Mine tailings from a closed operation in the 90s. Heavy metals in the sediment. It was, genuinely, something that needed doing, and Everett, hired on as an independent environmental assessor by the municipality, had approached it the way he approached everything, methodically, completely, without managing anyone's expectations about what he was going to find. What he found was that the proposed remediation corridor had been drawn several hundred meters short of where the contamination actually extended. The shortfall wasn't accidental. He'd looked at the original survey data and the proposed boundaries, and there was no reasonable interpretation that fit both of them simultaneously unless you were trying to exclude a particular parcel of land from the remediation mandate. A parcel that, he later discovered, Hallett Bryce had already quietly optioned for a separate commercial development. He wrote a report. That's what he did. He documented the discrepancy, cited the survey data, flagged the boundary issue, and submitted it to the Municipal Assessment Committee. 3 weeks later, the committee chair informed him, with visible discomfort, that his contract had been terminated. The project was proceeding with a revised assessment from a different firm. The boundary hadn't changed. He looked into it. He shouldn't have been surprised, but he was, a little, because he'd grown up believing, not naively, just functionally, that documentation meant something, that a fact once written down and submitted through the correct channel had a kind of permanence. It didn't when the other side had Gordon Bryce. Hallett Bryce had retained a consultant firm that employed 3 former members of the Provincial Environmental Review Board. The municipal committee had approved the revised assessment in under 2 weeks. Everett had written to 2 different ministries. He'd spoken with a journalist in Sudbury who'd been interested for about 10 days and then gone quiet. He'd retained a lawyer for the 4 months he could afford a lawyer, and then he couldn't afford a lawyer anymore. And the Clearwater Renewal Project had proceeded on its original terms, excluding its original parcel, and nothing had happened to anyone who had made that happen. And the contamination still ran along the eastern edge of Dunmore, beneath a stretch of ground that was now being cleared for a light industrial facility. And Everett Solano had lost the contract, the referral network that came from that contract, and 6 months of work while he rebuilt. And Nina had turned 5, and then 6, and then 7, and she asked him about spiders. He made tea. He didn't know why he made tea, except that his mother had always made tea when something serious was happening, as if the act of boiling water created a container for difficult things. Catherine Bryce Hallett sat at his kitchen table with her portfolio closed in front of her and her hands flat on it. She didn't look around the kitchen the way some people do when they enter a house smaller than they're used to, cataloging the differences, consciously or not. She looked at him. "My father died in February," she said. "Cardiac event." "He was 73, I know," Everett said. "I read the obituary." She absorbed this without flinching. "Then you know he left the company to me." "I'd been on the board for 6 years, but I hadn't run operations." "Why not?" "Because my father ran operations," she said. "The way certain men run operations, meaning he ran them until there was no room for anyone else to run anything." Everett said nothing. The kettle came to a boil. He poured water over 2 bags of Earl Grey and set 1 mug in front of her and kept one for himself and sat down. "When I took over," Catherine said, "I had to go through everything. Projects, agreements, contracts, legal exposure, standard succession process. We have a team, of course, but I go through it myself as well." She paused. "I found the Clearwater file." Everett wrapped both hands around his mug. "Not the public file," she said. "The internal one." He looked at her. "There were communications," she said, "between my father and the chair of the assessment committee. There was correspondence with the replacement assessor, prior to their formal engagement, which is relevant. There was documentation of the parcel acquisition and its relationship to the project boundary decisions that my father had apparently been careful to keep entirely off the formal record, but not careful enough to delete from his own system, which says something, I think, about what certain people believe about their own permanence." She slid a hand to the edge of the portfolio and rested it there, not opening it yet. "What do you want from me?" Everett said. It was the only honest question. He wasn't going to dress it up. "I want to do what should have been done," Catherine said, "which is several things. The contamination boundary needs to be reassessed, and the remediation scope needs to be expanded. I've already retained an independent firm, not one of ours, to conduct a full environmental review. That process is underway. I've also instructed our legal team to notify the relevant provincial ministries about the communications I found, which will have consequences I am prepared to accept. For your company." "For my company," she confirmed, "and for your father's memory." Something moved across her face. Not quite pain. something older than pain. Yes, she said, for that as well. Everett looked at the table. He'd sat at this table when Nina had her first bad fever at 2 in the morning, waiting for the medication to work. He'd sat here the night he'd read the committee's final decision on the Clearwater assessment and understood that there was nowhere else to take it. He'd sat here on a lot of nights that required sitting rather than sleeping. "The file," he said. "You brought it. A copy." "Yes." She opened the portfolio. "I thought you should see it. You deserve to see it. It's documentation of what was done in detail, and it has your name in it in several places." She met his eyes, in ways that were meant to diminish what you found. "I think you should know exactly what was said." He didn't reach for it right away. He looked at it sitting there between them, clean white pages, precise formatting, the architecture of something that had been built specifically to make him small and ineffective. And he felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. Something between them that didn't have a word in English, but that he suspected existed in other languages, in other cultures that had longer relationships with exactly this kind of moment. He picked up the file. He read for 40 minutes. Catherine sat across from him and drank her tea and didn't speak. Nina came downstairs once, looked at them both, and then retreated back upstairs with an apple and the particular expression that children develop when they grow up in homes where serious things are sometimes discussed at the kitchen table. The communications were methodical. That was the thing that struck him. Not that they existed, but that they were so methodical. Careful, deliberate. Gordon Bryce had understood what he was doing, and had done it with the calm precision of someone who had done this kind of thing before and expected to do it again. The emails to the committee chair, the scheduling of the replacement assessor's engagement, the legal language that had been drafted to insulate the boundary decision from challenge, and in the margin of one internal memo handwritten in a way that made it clearly Gordon's own annotation. Solano report to be characterized as incomplete and based on faulty methodology. Coordinate with engineering review team. Incomplete and faulty. Everett set the file down. "He had someone contest your methodology," Catherine said quietly, informally, through a colleague who sat on a provincial advisory panel. Everett's voice was even. He'd had years to make his voice even about this. It didn't go anywhere formal, but it was mentioned. In conversations. In the way things get mentioned. She nodded slowly. She'd known people like her father her whole life. She'd sat across from them at dinner. She'd listened to them speak at industry events about responsibility and stewardship. She'd accepted it as the texture of the world without examining what the texture was made of. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her carefully. He'd been looked at by people who said they were sorry and meant something complicated by it. Meant "I'm sorry you're upset," or "I'm sorry this is uncomfortable," or "I'm sorry in the way I'm sorry when it rains and I was planning to golf." She didn't mean any of those things. She meant the full, unqualified weight of the word, the way it's meant when someone understands specifically what was done and specifically who suffered for it. He hadn't expected it to land the way it did. "The remediation review," he said. "The independent firm. When do they begin?" "They've already started preliminary site sampling. I'd estimate a full report by early spring." "The ministry notifications submitted last week. I don't know what they'll do with them. I can't promise an outcome. I can only promise that the information is now with the people who are supposed to have it." He nodded. "And the parcel?" She looked at him steadily. "The light industrial development is on hold. I've suspended the permits pending the environmental review." A pause. "There are board members who are unhappy with this. I imagine. There are people who've told me it's bad for the company to go looking for problems that nobody is officially looking for." She picked up her tea mug, found it empty. "I told them that we were apparently already very good at ensuring nobody officially looked for problems, and that had turned out to be its own kind of problem." He almost smiled. He didn't quite. "What do you want from me?" he asked again. It was the second time. The second time it meant something different. She understood the difference. "Nothing," she said. "I didn't come here to ask you for anything. I came because you deserved to know what happened in full and why, and because I wanted to say it to your face." She put down the empty mug. "You could have walked away from that assessment. You could have adjusted your findings. People do. My father knew what he was doing when he hired independent assessors. He knew which ones were adjustable and which ones weren't, and he hired the adjustable ones, and when you turned out not to be adjustable, he did what he did." Everett said nothing. "I want you to know," Catherine said, "that what he did was wrong. Not in a regulatory sense, although it was that too, but specifically wrong to you, to your work, to the people in this town who live near that tributary." She looked at the table. My father believed that what he did was just business. I don't believe that. I don't think you do either. No, Everett said. I don't. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the maples on Ridgecroft Lane were moving in a slow autumn wind, dropping the last of their red leaves onto the road. There's one more thing, Catherine said. He waited. The municipality's original assessment contract, the one that was terminated. I've spoken with the town council. There's a new water infrastructure review being scoped. Not remediation, a full infrastructure condition assessment for the Eastern Corridor. She picked up the portfolio and removed a second document, smaller, and set it on the table. I told them I thought you should be considered for it. I told them why. He looked at the document. A letter from the Director of Infrastructure Services, Dunmore Township, an invitation to submit a proposal. I didn't arrange it, she said. I only told them it should be considered. Whether you want it is entirely your decision. He looked at the letter for a long time. He thought about the 11 months after Diane. He thought about Lorena's pea soup and Nina's spider questions and the way this town looked in September, the way it had always looked. The maples going and the air going cold, the particular quality of light over a place that has been home long enough to live in your body. He thought about sitting at this table at 2 in the morning waiting for a fever to break. He thought about a file that had his name in it under the words incomplete and faulty. I'll submit a proposal, he said. There were things that didn't resolve cleanly. That's the thing about real situations. They don't end with everything accounted for. The Provincial Ministry Review took the better part of a year and produced a report that led to administrative penalties for 2 individuals and a set of regulatory amendments that were meaningful in a technical sense and invisible to everyone outside of technical circles. The committee chair retired quietly. The replacement assessor lost a subsequent contract under different circumstances that were not publicly connected to Clearwater, but that people who paid attention understood were connected to Clearwater. Gordon Bryce had died in February, believing that what he'd done was simply the way things were done. And he'd been right in the sense that it was, in fact, the way such things were often done, and wrong in the way that doesn't become clear until someone decides to hold the file up to the light. The light industrial development on the eastern parcel was ultimately not built. The expanded remediation project began the following summer, and Everett, through no formal connection, just the small world logic of Northern Ontario environmental work, ended up reviewing a section of the original sediment boundary determination as part of the infrastructure assessment. He did not comment on it publicly. He documented what he found. He submitted it through the correct channel. He understood by then that documentation meant something, just not always in the way or time frame you expected. Catherine drove back to Toronto on a Tuesday afternoon with the maples of Ridgecroft Lane in her rearview mirror, and she did not feel absolved. She hadn't come for absolution. She'd come because her father had left her a company and a set of decisions that had been made on her behalf without her knowledge. And she'd decided, in the way that some people decide things, not after a long deliberation, but after a very clear moment of understanding, that she would not hold what he'd built by pretending it had only been built with clean hands. There would be costs to this, there already were. There would be board meetings and legal consultations and conversations where people looked at her like she was doing something incomprehensible. She had accepted this. What she hadn't expected was the kitchen. She hadn't expected to sit at a worn table in a small house on a quiet street in a mill town that had seen better economic decades and drink tea while a man read quietly and completely the documentation of what had been done to him. She hadn't expected that the act of simply delivering the truth, no more than that, just the truth, laid out on a table, would feel like the most significant thing she'd done since taking her father's chair. She thought about his daughter, Nina, appearing at the top of the stairs with an apple, assessing the situation with the calm peripheral intelligence of a child who had learned to read rooms, and then retreating. She thought about what it meant to grow up knowing your father as someone who came home. She drove south on Highway 144, and the trees on either side of the road were enormous and old and completely indifferent to her, and she was glad for that. Nina asked her father that evening whether he thought the spider question could be answered scientifically. He said he thought probably yes, eventually, once the science got good enough. She thought about this for a while. Do you think they dream about webs? She said. Maybe, Everett said. Or maybe they dream about something we don't have a word for yet. She seemed to find this satisfying in a way the earlier answer hadn't been. He sat with her until she fell asleep, in the particular way that parents sit beside sleeping children, Not doing anything, just being there, as if the act of staying present is itself a form of maintenance, a way of keeping something intact. The maples outside had lost almost everything by then. The branches were bare against the September sky, and the street was quiet, and the light over Dunmore was the long, flat light of a northern Ontario evening in autumn, which doesn't look like anything else in the world, if you know what you're looking at. He had always known what he was looking at. That was the thing about Everett Solano, that had always been the thing.